Miss Marple's vanished guest. The room was locked, yet they fled. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Briarwood Manor. The late autumn sun cast a golden haze over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the quaint village where Miss Jane Marple sat in, her cosy parlour, a delicate teacup balanced in her hand. The fire crackled softly, and outside the leaves whispered secrets to the wind. It was a day like any other, save for the curious envelope that had arrived with the morning post, its heavy, cream paper embossed with a crest she did not recognize. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the letter. The handwriting was elegant, almost ostentatious, and the wax seal bore the initials L.H. She broke it open with care, unfolding a single sheet that invited her, in the most courteous terms, to spend a weekend at Briarwood Manor, the country estate of Lord Lionel Harrington. The occasion was vague, a gathering of distinguished persons to discuss matters of mutual interest. No further details were provided, save for a promise of hospitality and a request for her presence by Friday evening. "Most peculiar," Miss Marple murmured, her keen eyes narrowing. She was no stranger to invitations, but they were rarely so cryptic, nor did they come from lords she had never met. Lord Harrington's name was faintly familiar, a whisper from the society pages, but she could recall little else. Her fingers tapped lightly on the arm of her chair, a habit when her mind began to weave threads of curiosity. A weekend away, she said to herself, might be just the thing. By Friday, Miss Marple found herself in a chauffeured car, winding through the misty hills of the countryside. The driver, a taciturn man with a face like weathered oak, offered no conversation, and Miss Marple was content to observe the landscape. Briarwood Manor emerged from the fog like a spectre, its Gothic spires piercing the sky. The estate sprawled across acres of manicured lawns, its stone facade both grand and forbidding, as though it guarded secrets older than its current master. Car crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, and Miss Marple was ushered into the manor's cavernous hall. A chandelier glittered above, casting fractured light on marble floors. But the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and wax. A butler, stiff as a statue, greeted her with a bow. "Miss Marple, I presume. Lord Harrington awaits you in the drawing-room." The drawing-room was a study in opulence, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. A fire roared in the hearth, and a dozen or so guests mingled, their voices a low hum of polite chatter. Lord Harrington stood at the centre, a tall man with silver hair and a smile that seemed to flicker like the flames. His eyes, sharp and searching, met Miss Marple's as he approached. "Miss Marple, how delightful that you could join us," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "I trust the journey was not too taxing." "Not at all, Lord Harrington," she replied, her tone mild, but her gaze steady. "Your invitation was most intriguing. I confess I'm curious about the occasion." Chuckled, a sound that did not quite reach his eyes. "All in good time, my dear lady. Tonight we dine and enjoy one another's company. Tomorrow we shall discuss matters of import." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already cataloguing the room. The guests were an eclectic assembly, each distinct in manner and dress. There was Mrs. Evelyn Carver, a widow draped in black lace, her laughter brittle as glass. Beside her stood Mr. Julian Drake, a young barrister with a nervous habit of adjusting his cufflinks. A foreign gentleman, introduced as Monsieur Dupont, watched the room with hooded eyes, his fingers tracing the stem of a wine-glass. Miss Clara Vaughan, a novelist of some repute, scribbled in a notebook, her sharp glances missing nothing. And then there was Mr. Thomas Reed, a broad-shouldered man with a soldier's bearing, who seemed ill at ease in his tailored suit. As the evening progressed, Miss Marple sipped her sherry and listened, her unassuming presence allowing conversations to flow around her. She noted the undercurrents, the way Mrs. Carver's smile tightened when Lord Harrington mentioned a recent inheritance, or how Mr. Drake's eyes darted toward the door whenever a servant passed. Monsieur Dupont spoke little, but his silence was heavy, as though he carried a weight he dared not share. Miss Vaughan, meanwhile, peppered the group with questions, her curiosity bordering on intrusive. Dinner was a lavish affair, with courses of pheasant and syllabub served on gleaming silver. Yet Miss Marple sensed a tension beneath the polished surface, a thread of unease that tugged at the edges of every conversation. Lord Harrington was charming, regaling the table with tales of his travels, but his anecdotes felt rehearsed, his glances too deliberate. As the clock struck 10, he rose, tapping a spoon against his glass. "My dear guests," he said, his voice commanding attention, "I've invited you here for a purpose, one that will become clear tomorrow evening in the library. For now, I bid you good night and urge you to rest well." The guests murmured their thanks and dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the vast halls. Miss Marple retired to her room, a spacious chamber with a four-poster bed and a window overlooking the darkened gardens. She sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, but her mind was far from idle. The invitation, the manner, the guests, each was a piece in a puzzle she had yet to assemble. As she drifted towards sleep, a faint sound reached her ears, a creak like a floorboard under cautious weight, somewhere beyond her door. She smiled, faintly, her instincts humming. Briarwood Manor, it seemed, was already whispering its secrets. Chapter 2. The Locked Room. The following evening at Briarwood Manor descended with a chill that seemed to seep through the very walls. Miss Marple, dressed in her customary tweed and a lavender shawl, joined the other guests in the grand library, where Lord Harrington had promised his mysterious announcement. The room was a cavern of knowledge, its towering shelves stuffed with leather-bound tomes, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and polish. A single chandelier cast a warm glow, but shadows clung to the corners, as though reluctant to reveal their secrets. The guests arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Mrs. Evelyn Carver fanned herself with a lace handkerchief, her eyes darting toward Lord Harrington. Mr. Julian Drake stood rigid, his fingers twisting a pocket-watch. Monsieur Dupont leaned against a bookshelf, his expression unreadable, while Miss Clara Vaughan scribbled furiously in her notebook, her pen scratching like a restless insect. Mr. Thomas Reed paced near the hearth, his heavy steps muffled by the Persian rug. Lord Harrington, at the centre, held a commanding presence, his silver hair catching the light as he surveyed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonant, "I thank you for your patience. Tonight I shall reveal the purpose of our gathering, a matter of grave importance." He paused, his gaze lingering on each guest, as though weighing their worth. "But first, to ensure our privacy, I shall lock the door." He crossed to the heavy oak door, its brass fittings gleaming, and turned the key with a deliberate click. The sound echoed, final and foreboding. Miss Marple, seated near the window, noted the key's ornate design and the solid construction of the lock. She also observed the windows, tall but barred and latched from within, offering no easy exit. Her eyes flicked to the guests, cataloguing their reactions. Mrs. Carver's sharp intake of breath, Mr. Drake's tightened jaw, Monsieur Dupont's slight frown. Lord Harrington returned to the centre, clasping his hands. "What I'm about to disclose concerns a legacy, one that binds us all in ways you may not yet understand." His words were cut short by a sudden, piercing scream, a sound that seemed to claw at the very walls. The room froze. The scream had come from Miss Clara Vaughan, who stood trembling, her notebook fallen to the floor. "He's gone!" she gasped, pointing toward the spot where Mr. Thomas Reed had been pacing moments before. Every head turned, and a collective gasp rippled through the group. The space by the hearth was empty. Mr. Reed, the broad-shouldered soldier, had vanished. "Impossible!" Lord Harrington barked, striding to the hearth as though expecting to find Reed hidden behind the fire screen. "He was just here." Miss Marple rose, her movements calm but purposeful, and joined the others as they scanned the room. The library was unchanged, shelves intact, windows secure, the door still locked. Mrs. Carver clutched her pearls, her voice shrill. "He can't have just disappeared. People don't vanish into thin air." "Stay calm," Miss Marple said softly, her tone steadying the room. "Let us be methodical. Lord Harrington, the key, if you please." Harrington fumbled in his pocket, producing the key with a shaking hand. He crossed to the door and turned it, the lock clicking open. The door swung inward, revealing the empty corridor beyond, lit by flickering sconces. No trace of Mr. Reed, no footsteps, no shadow, nothing. "He was standing right there," Mr. Drake stammered, pointing at the hearth. "I saw him not 2 minutes ago." Monsieur Dupont's voice was low, almost a whisper. "The door was locked. The windows are barred. How could he leave?" Miss Vaughan, regaining her composure, retrieved her notebook and began scribbling again, her eyes wide. "This is extraordinary," she muttered, as though the mystery were a plot for her next novel. Miss Marple knelt by the hearth, her fingers brushing the rug. She noted its texture, the faint dust on the nearby shelves, the precise placement of the fire irons. Her gaze swept upward to the chandelier, then down to the floorboards, searching for anything amiss. "Did anyone see Mr. Reed move?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. The guests exchanged glances, their denials overlapping. "He was pacing," Mrs. Carver said. "Then I looked away when Lord Harrington spoke." "I was watching Miss Vaughan," Mr. Drake admitted, flushing. "Her scream startled me." "I saw nothing," Monsieur Dupont said, his tone clipped. "One moment he was there, the next, gone." Lord Harrington, his face pale, ran a hand through his hair. "This is madness. We must search the manor at once." Miss Marple held up a hand, her authority quiet but undeniable. "A search, yes, but first let us secure this room. No one must touch anything until we understand what has happened." She turned to the butler, who had appeared at the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "Mr. Grayson, please fetch a lantern, and ensure no one enters or leaves the library without my knowledge." The butler nodded, his face impassive, and departed. The guests, now huddled together, whispered among themselves, their voices tinged with fear and suspicion. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting retrieved from her bag, but her needles remained still. Her mind was already at work, sifting through the impossible. A man vanished from a locked room, with no trace, no sound, no explanation. As the lantern's light flickered across the library, casting long shadows, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. The puzzle of Briarwood Manor had begun, and she would not rest until its pieces fell into place. Chapter 3. Shadows on the Guest List. The library of Briarwood Manor, though grand in its proportions, seemed to shrink under the weight of the guests' unease. The chandelier's light flickered, casting restless shadows across the faces of those gathered, each now a suspect in the impossible disappearance of Mr. Thomas Reed. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a high-backed chair, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm that belied the sharpness of her observations. The butler, Mr. Grayson, stood guard at the door, his presence a silent reminder that no one was to leave until Miss Marple deemed it so. Lord Harrington paced before the hearth, his earlier composure fraying. "This is preposterous," he muttered, his voice tight. "A man cannot simply vanish. There must be an explanation, a trapdoor, a hidden panel." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the floorboards, then to the walls, but she said nothing. She had already examined the hearth and found no sign of concealed mechanisms. Instead, her attention turned to the guests, their faces a tapestry of fear, guilt, and calculation. "Lord Harrington," she said mildly, "perhaps we might learn more by understanding our company. Mr. Reed's disappearance is no accident, and those present may hold the key to its meaning." The room stilled, the weight of her words settling like dust. Mrs. Evelyn Carver clutched her handkerchief, her eyes wide. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? That one of us is responsible?" "Not suggesting, Mrs. Carver," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "Merely observing. Shall we begin with you? You seemed quite distressed during Lord Harrington's speech last night. Might you share what troubles you?" Mrs. Carver stiffened, her lips pursing. "I was merely tired," she said, her voice brittle. "This manor, with its creaks and shadows, is enough to unsettle anyone." But her fingers twisted the handkerchief into knots, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hands. She recalled a snippet from the previous evening, Mrs. Carver's sharp glance when Lord Harrington mentioned an inheritance. There was history there, perhaps tied to her late husband's fortune, which rumour held had dwindled mysteriously. Miss Marple turned to Mr. Julian Drake, the young barrister, whose pallor had deepened since the scream. "And you, Mr. Drake, you were watching Miss Vaughan when Mr. Reed vanished. Did you know him well?" Drake's hand flew to his cufflinks, a nervous tick. "Know him? Hardly. We exchanged pleasantries, nothing more." His voice cracked and he cleared his throat. "I was distracted, yes, but I saw nothing untoward." Yet his eyes darted to the door, as though he longed to flee. Miss Marple remembered his fidgeting at dinner, his unease when Reed had spoken of his military service. A barrister might cross paths with a soldier in court, she mused, perhaps over a case that left grudges. Monsieur Dupont, leaning against a bookshelf, met Miss Marple's gaze with a cool stare. "You have questions for me, mademoiselle?" His French accent was polished, but his fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the shelf. "I am a businessman, here at Lord Harrington's invitation. I knew this Monsieur Reed not at all, yet—" "You watched him closely last night," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as a breeze. "I wonder why." Dupont's lips twitched, but he offered no reply. She had noted his reticence, his habit of lingering on the edges of conversations. A businessman, perhaps, but one with secrets, possibly tied to Reed's past, which might extend beyond England's borders. Miss Clara Vaughan, the novelist, snapped her notebook shut, her eyes bright with indignation. "This is absurd. You're treating us like characters in one of my stories, Miss Marple. I was writing, not plotting disappearances." She gestured to her notebook, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in her hand. Vaughan's questions. A dinner had been pointed, especially about Reed's time abroad. A novelist's curiosity, or something more personal? Lord Harrington stopped pacing, his face flushed. "Enough of this, Miss Marple. I invited these people in good faith. To suggest they're involved in some conspiracy is outrageous." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes meeting his. "Mr. Reed was no stranger to you, Lord Harrington. You greeted him warmly last night, yet you hesitated when he mentioned a shared acquaintance. Who was it, I wonder?" Her question hung in the air, and Harrington's jaw tightened. She had seen the flicker of unease in his eyes. A host with secrets, perhaps tied to the legacy he had hinted at. The guests shifted, their glances darting like trapped moths. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice calm but piercing. "Mr. Reed was a soldier, a man of discipline and strength. His disappearance required planning, perhaps knowledge of this manor or its guests. Did any of you speak with him privately? Did he confide anything unusual?" Silence followed, thick and heavy. Then Mrs. Carver spoke, her voice barely above, a whisper. He asked me about my husband's business dealings. It was odd, as though he knew something. Her words sparked a murmur, and Mr. Drake's face paled further. "Business dealings?" Monsieur Dupont echoed, his tone sharp. "What kind, madam?" "Enough," Lord Harrington snapped. "We're not on trial here." But Miss Marple's mind was already weaving threads. Reed's questions, the guests' evasions, the locked room. They formed a pattern, incomplete but emerging. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and addressed the group. "I propose we search the manor, as Lord Harrington suggested, but with care. Mr. Grayson, please ensure the library remains untouched. The rest of you, pair with someone you trust. We shall reconvene in an hour." As the guests paired off, their choices revealing alliances, Mrs. Carver with Miss Vaughan, Drake with Dupont, Harrington alone. Miss Marple lingered by the hearth. Her fingers brushed the rug again, her eyes scanning the shelves. The room held its secrets tightly, but so did the guests, and she suspected the shadows on their pasts would soon cast light on Mr. Reed's fate. Chapter 4. The Key That Wasn't There. The search of Briarwood Manor had yielded nothing. No trace of Mr. Thomas Reed, no hidden passages, no sign of struggle. The guests reconvened in the library, their faces etched with frustration and unease, as the grandfather clock in the corner ticked toward midnight. Miss Jane Marple stood near the locked door, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her eyes tracing the brass fittings of the lock. The key, that ornate piece Lord Harrington had used to seal the room, was now the focus of her attention, for its whereabouts had become as mysterious as the vanished guest himself. Lord Harrington, his silver hair dishevelled, held the key aloft, its intricate design catching the chandelier's light. "I locked the door with this," he said, his voice strained. "I placed it in my pocket, and when Miss Vaughan screamed, I used it to unlock the door. It's been with me the entire time." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild, but her gaze piercing. "Are you quite certain, Lord Harrington? You fumbled for it when I asked you to open the door. A moment's hesitation, perhaps, but noticeable." Harrington's cheeks reddened. "I was shaken, Miss Marple. A man had just vanished. Surely you don't think I misplaced it?" "Not misplaced," she said softly, "but perhaps unaccounted for." She turned to the others who stood in a tense cluster near the hearth. Did anyone see Lord Harrington with the key before the scream? Or perhaps afterward, when the door was opened? Mrs. Evelyn Carver, her black lace dress rustling, shook her head. "I was too startled to notice. I assumed he had it, as he said." Her voice was clipped, but her eyes flicked toward Harrington, a flicker of doubt betraying her words. Mr. Julian Drake, his cufflinks glinting as he adjusted them, cleared his throat. "I saw him lock the door, yes, but after the scream I was looking at the hearth, where Reed had been." His hesitation hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow. Monsieur Dupont, his arms crossed, offered a curt nod. "I saw the key in his hand when he locked the door. Afterward I cannot say. The chaos distracted me." His tone was neutral, but his fingers tapped a restless rhythm against his sleeve. Miss Clara Vaughan, clutching her notebook, pursed her lips. "I was writing when he locked the door, but I'm certain I saw him put the key in his waistcoat pocket. When he opened the door, though," she trailed off, her brow furrowing, "it seemed to take him a moment to find it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she retrieved her knitting, though her hands moved almost absently. "A moment," she repeated, her voice thoughtful. "And yet, Lord Harrington, you insist the key never left your possession. Curious, is it not, that no one can confirm its whereabouts in those critical seconds?" Harrington's jaw tightened. "What are you implying, Miss Marple? That I'm lying, or that someone stole it from my pocket in the blink of an eye?" "Not stolen, perhaps," she said, her eyes narrowing, "but handled or misplaced, even briefly. Let us consider the lock itself." She approached the door, her fingers brushing the brass plate. The lock was sturdy, its mechanism complex, designed for security rather than convenience. "Mr. Grayson," she called to the butler, who stood sentinel at the threshold, "how many keys exist for this door?" Grayson's face remained impassive. "Only one, madam, to my knowledge. It is kept by Lord Harrington, as the library contains valuable manuscripts." "And no duplicates?" Miss Marple pressed. "None, madam," Grayson replied, though his eyes flickered briefly toward his employer. Miss Marple nodded, her mind sifting through possibilities. A single key, yet the door had been locked and unlocked with no apparent tampering. She turned to the guests, her voice calm but commanding. "Let us reconstruct the moment. Lord Harrington, you locked the door." Mr. Reed was pacing by the hearth, Miss Vaughan screamed, and then— "I ran to the door," Harrington said, his voice gruff. "I pulled the key from my pocket and opened it. The corridor was empty. And in that time," Miss Marple said, "no one approached you. No one brushed past. No one," he insisted, but his eyes darted to Mrs. Carver, who stood closest to him during the chaos. Mrs. Carver gasped. "You can't think I touched it. I was frozen, terrified." Yet her hands twisted her handkerchief, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush on her cheeks. Miss Marple stepped back, her gaze sweeping the room. The key, the lock, the guests' accounts, they formed a puzzle with missing pieces. She approached the hearth where Reed had last been seen, and knelt to examine the rug once more. Her fingers paused over a faint crease, barely noticeable, as though something heavy had been dragged briefly across it. She filed the observation away, her mind turning to the guest's behaviour. "Mr. Drake," she said, rising, "you were nearest the door when the scream occurred. Did you see anyone move toward Lord Harrington?" Drake swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "No, I was looking at Miss Vaughan. Her scream startled me." "And you, Monsieur Dupont?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes locking onto his. Dupont shrugged, his expression cool. "I was by the shelves. I saw only confusion." Miss Vaughan interjected, her voice sharp. "This is pointless. The key doesn't explain how Reed vanished. The room was sealed, windows barred, door locked. We're chasing shadows." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Shadows, Miss Vaughan, often reveal what light conceals. The key is a detail, but details are the threads of truth." She turned to Harrington. "May I examine the key, please?" Harrington hesitated, then handed it over. Miss Marple held it to the light, noting its weight, the intricate engravings, the slight wear on its teeth. It was indeed a unique piece, but something about its sheen caught her eye. A faint smudge, as though it had been handled by more than one person. She returned it without comment, her mind racing. "We shall continue our inquiries tomorrow," she said, her tone final. "For now, I suggest we retire. Mr. Grayson, please ensure the library is locked and the key accounted for." The guests dispersed, their whispers trailing like smoke. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the door. The key that wasn't there, the crease in the rug, the guests' evasions. They were clues, small but significant. The mystery of Mr. Reed's disappearance was no mere trick. It was a calculated act, and the key, she suspected, was only the beginning. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Walls. The night at Briarwood Manor was restless, its silence broken by the occasional groan of ancient timbers and the distant howl of wind through the hills. Miss Jane Marple lay awake in her four-poster bed, her knitting folded neatly on the bedside table, her mind far from sleep. The mystery of Mr. Thomas Reed's disappearance gnawed at her. Its pieces, the locked room, the elusive key, the crease in the rug, forming a pattern she could not yet fully discern. But another sound, faint and deliberate, had caught her attention. A soft thud, followed by a muffled scrape emanating from somewhere beyond her bedroom walls. She rose, slipping on her shawl and soft-soled shoes, and lit a small oil lamp. This flame cast a warm glow, illuminating the intricate wallpaper and heavy drapes of her chamber. The sound came again, a whisper of movement, like footsteps muffled by stone. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Briarwood Manor," she murmured. "You are not so silent as you seem." She stepped into the corridor, her lamp held high, and paused to listen. The manor was a labyrinth of passages, its Gothic arches and shadowed alcoves lending an air of secrecy. The other guests' rooms were nearby, their doors closed, but the stillness felt deceptive, as though the house itself were watching. The sound came once more, fainter now, from the direction of the library. Miss Marple moved with quiet purpose, her steps light but steady, her senses attuned to the manor's whispers. The library door was locked, as she had instructed, the key entrusted to Mr. Grayson. She pressed her ear to the oak, but no sound came from within. Instead, the noise, a low, rhythmic tapping, seemed to originate from the wall to her left, where a faded tapestry hung, depicting a hunt in muted greens and golds. Miss Marple set her lamp on a nearby table and ran her fingers along the tapestry's edge. The fabric was heavy, but it shifted slightly, revealing a seam in the panelling beneath. "A curious place for a draught," she said softly, noting a faint coolness against her fingertips. She pressed gently, and the panel gave a soft click, swinging inward to reveal a narrow passage barely wide enough for a single person. The air within was musty, tinged with the scent of damp stone and old wood. Miss Marple hesitated, her practical nature weighing the risks, but her curiosity won. She retrieved her lamp and stepped inside, the panel closing behind her with a muted thud. The passage was cramped, its walls rough-hewn, its floor uneven. Cobwebs brushed her shoulders, and the tapping grew louder, echoing ahead. Miss Marple moved slowly, her lamp casting long shadows that danced like spectres. The passage sloped downward, then turned sharply, ending at a small alcove with a rusted iron grate set into the floor. The tapping had ceased, but a faint scuff mark on the stone suggested recent passage. She knelt, her fingers tracing the grate's edges, and found it loose, as though it had been lifted and replaced. "Most intriguing," she murmured. The grate was too heavy for her to lift alone, but its presence hinted at a network of hidden roots within the manor, roots that might explain how a man could vanish from a locked room. She straightened, her mind racing. The library was directly above, its floorboards solid, but a passage beneath could connect to other parts of the house, perhaps even an exit unseen by the guests. As she retraced her steps, a sudden creak froze, her in place. The sound came from behind, near the panel's entrance. She doused her lamp, plunging the passage into darkness, and pressed herself against the wall. Footsteps, cautious but unmistakable, approached, then paused. A faint light flickered through the panel's seam, and a voice, low, male, and unfamiliar, muttered something indistinct. The panel creaked open, then closed, and the footsteps retreated. Miss Marple waited, her heart steady, until silence returned. She relit her lamp and emerged into the corridor, her expression thoughtful. The tapestry was undisturbed, but the encounter confirmed her suspicions. Someone else knew of the manor's secrets, and they were active under cover of night. By morning, the guests gathered in the dining room, their faces drawn from sleeplessness. Lord Harrington, his eyes shadowed, demanded updates, while Mrs. Evelyn Carver sipped her tea with trembling hands. Mr. Julian Drake avoided eye contact, his cufflinks untouched for once, and Monsieur Dupont's silence was heavier than ever. Miss Clara Vaughan, her notebook open, peppered the group with questions, her curiosity undimmed by the previous night's events. Miss Marple joined them, her demeanour serene, but her eyes sharp. "I trust you all slept well?" she asked, her tone carrying a hint of irony. The guests murmured non-committal replies, but she noted their unease. "Lord Harrington," she continued, "might I inquire about the manor's history? Old houses often have hidden features." Harrington frowned, his spoon pausing mid-air. "Hidden features? Briarwood is ancient, yes, built in the 17th century, but I know of no secret passages. Why do you ask?" "A fancy, perhaps," Miss Marple said lightly, though her gaze held his. "But old manors are rarely without their quirks. Servants' corridors, priest-holes, that sort of thing." Carver shivered. "Secret passages? How dreadful! Do you think Reed found one and escaped? Or was taken?" Monsieur Dupont said, his voice low. The room stilled, the implication hanging heavy. Miss Vaughan's pen scratched furiously. "This is material for a novel. A hidden passage leading from the library. Imagine it." Mr. Drake laughed nervously. "You're letting your imagination run wild, Miss Vaughan. The library was locked. No passage could explain that." Miss Marple said nothing, her needles clicking as she observed the group. The passage was real, but its role in Reed's disappearance was unclear. Had he stumbled upon it, or had someone used it to spirit him away? And who had been in the corridor last night, their footsteps betraying their presence? As breakfast ended, Miss Marple resolved to explore further, but with caution. The whispers in the walls were more than architectural quirks. They were clues to a calculated act, and she suspected the manor's secrets were intertwined with those of its guests. Chapter 6. The Vanished Guest's Secret. The morning light filtered weakly through Briarwood Manor's leaded windows, doing little to dispel the chill that clung to its halls. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, moved, with quiet purpose, toward the guest wing, where Mr. Thomas Reed's room lay untouched since his disappearance. The hidden passage she had discovered the previous night lingered in her mind, but another avenue demanded her attention: the belongings of the vanished guest. People she knew left traces of themselves in their possessions, and Reed's might hold the key to his fate. The corridor was silent, save for the faint creak of floorboards under her soft-soled shoes. The other guests were still at breakfast, their voices a distant murmur, but Miss Marple had excused herself early, citing a need for rest. In truth, rest was far from her mind. She reached Reed's door, a heavy oak panel like the others, and tested the handle. It was unlocked, a detail that struck her as curious. A man like Reed, a soldier accustomed to discipline, would likely secure his room in a strange house. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The room was Spartan, its furnishings simple compared to the manor's opulence. A single bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and a window overlooking the misty gardens. A military greatcoat hung on a peg, and a small leather satchel rested on the desk. Miss Marple's eyes swept the space, noting the absence of personal touches. No photographs, no books, only the essentials of a man accustomed to travel. She began with the satchel, her fingers deft as she unbuckled it. Inside were a few shirts, a shaving kit, and a worn notebook, its pages filled with terse entries about travel routes and expenses. Nothing remarkable, yet she set it aside for closer inspection. The wardrobe yielded only a spare suit and polished boots, their soles caked with dried mud. A clue, perhaps, that Reed had explored the grounds before his disappearance. It was beneath the bed that Miss Marple found her prize. Tucked against the frame, hidden from casual view, was a small envelope, its edges yellowed but intact. She retrieved it with care, noting the lack of a seal or address. Inside was a single sheet, folded tightly, its ink faded but legible. The letter was addressed to my dear Lionel, and signed E.R. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, and read, her lips pursing as the words unfolded a story of betrayal and debt. The writer, presumably Reed, addressed Lord Harrington with familiarity, recalling a shared venture years ago, a business deal that had soured, leaving Reed ruined and Harrington enriched. The letter hinted at evidence, documents that would not sit well with your peers, and demanded a meeting to settle accounts. The tone was not threatening, but resolute, the words of a man seeking justice rather than revenge. Most illuminating, Miss Marple murmured, slipping the letter into her pocket. Reed was no mere guest. He was a figure from Harrington's past, a ghost come to haunt the manor's master. The legacy Harrington had mentioned in the library took on new meaning. Perhaps a fortune built on another's ruin, one Reed had come to challenge. She continued her search, her fingers probing the desk's drawers. A loose panel at the back gave way, revealing a hidden compartment containing a single item, a tarnished pocket watch, its face cracked but its inscription clear. To TR, with gratitude LH. The initials confirmed the connection. Lord Harrington had once valued Reed, perhaps as a partner or friend, before their paths diverged. As she replaced the panel, a floorboard creaked outside the door. Miss Marple froze, her senses sharp. The handle turned slowly, and the door eased open to reveal Miss Clara Vaughan, her notebook clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with surprise. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to find you here." "Nor I you, Miss Vaughan," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, but her gaze steady. "Might I ask what brings you to Mr. Reed's room?" Vaughan flushed, her fingers tightening on her A notebook. "I thought, as a writer, I might find inspiration. His disappearance is so extraordinary, and I wondered if his things might hold clues for a story." Her words tumbled out, too quick, and Miss Marple noted the nervous glance toward the desk. "Clues for a story," Miss Marple echoed, her smile faint. "Or perhaps something more personal. You asked Mr. Reed pointed questions at dinner, I recall. Did you know him before this weekend?" Vaughan's lips parted, then closed. "No, not really. I'd heard of him. A soldier with a reputation for bravery. I was curious, that's all." She backed toward the door, her composure fraying. "I should return to the others. Excuse me." Miss Marple watched her go, her mind cataloguing the encounter. Vaughan's presence was no coincidence. She sought something specific, perhaps tied to Reed's past. The letter and watch suggested a motive for his disappearance. Someone, possibly Harrington, had reason to silence him before he could expose their shared history. At luncheon, the guests gathered in the dining room, their faces drawn from sleeplessness and suspicion. Lord Harrington, his charm diminished, avoided Miss Marple's gaze, while Mrs. Evelyn Carver whispered to Mr. Julian Drake their heads bent close. Monsieur Dupont ate in silence, his eyes flicking to the door, and Miss Vaughan scribbled in her notebook, her pen moving with feverish intensity. Miss Marple joined them, her demeanour serene, but her thoughts racing. "Lord Harrington," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur, "might I ask about your acquaintance with Mr. Reed? You seem to share a history, one that made him a significant guest." Harrington's fork paused, his knuckles whitening. "A history? We met years ago during my travels. A passing acquaintance, nothing more." His tone was clipped, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand. "Yet he was invited here," she pressed gently. "For a purpose, you said. One wonders if that purpose was uncomfortable for you." The room stilled, the guests' eyes on their host. Harrington forced a laugh, but it rang hollow. "Uncomfortable? Miss Marple, you read too much into simple hospitality. Reed was here to discuss business, nothing sinister." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. The letter burned in her pocket, its words a silent accusation. Reed's secret was no longer his alone, and as she studied the guests' faces, she knew the truth lay not just in the manor's walls, but in the shadows of their pasts. Chapter 7. The alibi that crumbled the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Briarwood Manor's drawing-room, where the guests had gathered at Miss Jane Marple's request. The air was thick with unease, the memory of Mr. Thomas Reed's disappearance hanging over them like a storm cloud. Miss Marple sat near the fireplace, her knitting needles moving with their usual rhythm, but her eyes were sharp, fixed on Mr. Julian Drake. The young barrister stood by the window, his fingers fidgeting with his cufflinks, his face pale as though he sensed the weight of her scrutiny. The other guests, Lord Harrington, Mrs. Evelyn Carver, Monsieur Dupont and Miss Clara Vaughan, sat in a tense semicircle, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The letter Miss Marple had found in Reed's room, with its accusations against Harrington, burned in her mind. But another thread demanded her attention. The alibis of those present when Reed vanished. Drake's account, in particular, had struck her as too polished, too convenient, and she intended to test its strength. "Mr. Drake," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but carrying the authority of one accustomed to uncovering truth, "you've been most helpful in recounting the events in the library. But I find myself puzzled by a small detail. You said you were watching Miss Vaughan when Mr. Reed disappeared, startled by her scream. Yet you were nearest the door, were you not?" Drake's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "Yes, I was near the door," he said, his voice steady but strained. "I was admiring Miss Vaughan's dedication to her writing. When she screamed, I turned to the hearth where Reed had been. That's when I realized he was gone." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Admiring her writing," she repeated, her tone thoughtful. From across the room, through a crowd of guests in the dim light of the chandelier. "Your attention must be remarkably focused, Mr. Drake." A nervous laugh escaped him, and he adjusted his cufflinks again. "Well, I suppose I was distracted, not entirely focused. It was a chaotic moment, Miss Marple. Surely you understand." "Oh, I do," she said, her smile faint but her gaze unwavering. "Chaos often obscures truth, but it also reveals it. Let us clarify your position. You were by the door, facing Miss Vaughan. Yet you saw nothing of Lord Harrington's handling of the key, nor of Mr. Reed's movements. Is that correct?" Drake nodded too quickly. "Exactly. I saw nothing until the scream." Miss Vaughan, her notebook open on her lap, interjected, her voice sharp. "I don't see why this matters. Mr. Drake was nowhere near Reed. Why are you hounding him?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Vaughan, noting the defensiveness in her tone. "I hound no one, Miss Vaughan," she said gently. "I merely seek clarity. Mr. Drake's position by the door places him in a unique spot, one where he might have seen or done something significant." Drake's face flushed, and he took a step forward. "Done something? Miss Marple, are you accusing me of what, exactly? I had no reason to harm Reed. I barely knew him." "Yet you seemed uneasy when he spoke of his military service at dinner," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but piercing. "I recall your hand trembling, your eyes avoiding his. Had you crossed paths before, perhaps in your work as a barrister? A case, maybe, that left ill feelings?" The room stilled, the guest's eyes on Drake. Lord Harrington, his jaw tight, leaned forward, while Mrs. Carver's handkerchief twisted in her hands. Monsieur Dupont's gaze was unreadable, but his fingers had stopped their restless tapping. Drake's composure cracked, his voice rising. "This is absurd. I've never met Reed in court or anywhere else. My unease was due to the manor's atmosphere, nothing more." But his eyes darted to the door, as though he longed to flee. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Then let us test your alibi further. You claim you were watching Miss Vaughan, yet she says she was writing, her head bent over her notebook. Did she look up at you, Mr. Drake? Did your eyes meet?" Drake hesitated, his mouth opening and closing. I don't recall. It was a fleeting moment." Miss Vaughan's pen paused, her cheeks colouring. "I didn't notice him watching me," she said, her voice low. "I was absorbed in my notes." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Curious, Mr. Drake, that your alibi rests on observing someone who did not observe you. And curious, too, that you were so near the door, where Lord Harrington fumbled for the key. Might you have seen, or even touched, that key in the chaos?" Drake's face drained of colour. "Touched it? No, I was nowhere near Harrington. I swear it." Lord Harrington stood, his voice booming. "Enough of this, Miss Marple. You're badgering the man without evidence. Drake's a guest in my home, not a criminal." Miss Marple met his gaze unruffled. "Evidence, Lord Harrington, is what I seek, and Mr. Drake's account, I'm afraid, does not hold." She turned back to Drake, her voice softening, almost maternal. "Tell me, Mr. Drake, what were you really doing by the door? The truth now will save us all time." Drake's shoulders slumped, his hands falling to his sides. I wasn't watching Miss Vaughan," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I was nervous, pacing near the door. Reed's talk of his service reminded me of a case. A client who'd been court-martialed. Someone Reed might have known. I was afraid he'd recognize me, that's all. But I didn't touch the key, and I didn't see him leave." The admission hung in the air, a crack in the facade of his alibi. Mrs. Carver gasped, and Monsieur Dupont's lips twitched, as though suppressing a smile. Miss Vaughan's pen scratched furiously, capturing every word. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Drake. Honesty, even belated, is a step toward truth. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly. We shall continue our inquiries. For now, I suggest we all reflect on what we've seen and what we've hidden. As the guests dispersed, their whispers trailing like smoke, Miss Marple lingered by the fireplace, her eyes on the hearth where Reed had last stood. Drake's lie was a small victory, but it pointed to a larger web, one woven from fear, guilt, and secrets. The locked room, the key, the hidden passage, and now a connection to Reed's military past. They were threads, and she was determined to follow them to their source. Chapter 8. Footprints in the Dust. The late afternoon at Briarwood Manor was cloaked in a heavy mist, the kind that seemed to muffle sound and sharpen suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, stood in the corridor, outside the library, her mind turning over the threads of the mystery. The hidden passage, the letter in Reed's room, Mr. Drake's crumbling alibi. Each clue pointed to a calculated act, but the how and why of Mr. Thomas Reed's disappearance remained elusive. A new lead, however, had presented itself. A faint trace she had noticed during her earlier inspection of the manor's upper floors. After Mr. Drake's reluctant admission, Miss Marple had excused herself from the drawing-room, citing a need to stretch her legs. In truth, she sought to explore the manor's less trodden spaces, particularly the attic, which Mr. Grayson, the butler, had mentioned was locked and rarely visited. Old houses, she knew, held their secrets in forgotten corners, and Briarwood's attic might reveal more than its dust and cobwebs. She climbed the narrow staircase to the third floor, her steps deliberate, her oil lamp casting a soft glow on the faded wallpaper. The air grew colder as she ascended, the manor's grandeur giving way to neglect. At the end of a dimly lit corridor, a heavy door barred access to the attic, its iron lock rusted but intact. Miss Marple paused, her eyes drawn to the floor. There, in the thick layer of dust, were faint footprints, too fresh to belong to the manor's distant past, their edges crisp despite the attempt to brush them away. Most curious, she murmured, kneeling to examine them. The prints were large, consistent with a man's boots, and led directly to the attic door before doubling back, as though someone had approached, then retreated. She traced their path with her lamp, noting a smudge where a heel had scuffed the floor. The prints were recent, perhaps from the previous night, and their presence suggested movement, possibly Reed's or someone else's in pursuit. Miss Marple tested the door's handle, but it held firm, the lock unyielding. She pressed her ear to the wood, listening for any sound, but the attic was silent, its secrets sealed within. Her fingers brushed the lock, noting its age and complexity. "A key," she said softly. "But whose?" Mr. Grayson had claimed the attic key was kept in the butler's pantry, accessible only to him and Lord Harrington. Yet the footprints told a different story, one of clandestine exploration. She followed the prints back down the corridor, where they faded near a servant's staircase. The trail was incomplete, but it confirmed her suspicion. Someone had been active in the manor, perhaps connected to the hidden passage she had discovered, or the library's locked door. Was Reed hiding in the attic, alive and evading capture? Or had someone else used the space to conceal evidence of his fate? Returning to the main floor, Miss Marple sought out Mr. Grayson, finding him polishing silver in the pantry. His face remained impassive as she approached, but his eyes flickered with curiosity. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her tone mild, "might I see the attic key? I've a fancy to explore the manor's history, and old attics are often full of stories." Grayson hesitated, his cloth pausing mid-motion. "The attic, madam. It's merely storage. Old furniture, nothing of interest. The key is here, but Lord Harrington prefers it undisturbed." "Even so," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming, "I'd be grateful for a look. Unless, of course, there's reason to keep it locked." Grayson's lips tightened, but he retrieved a ring of keys from a locked drawer, selecting one with a tarnished head. "I'll accompany you, madam. The attic is unsafe for a lady alone." Miss Marple nodded, noting his reluctance. They ascended to the attic door, where Grayson unlocked it with a heavy clunk. The door creaked open, revealing a vast, shadowed space filled with shrouded furniture trunks and cobwebs that hung like ghostly veils. The air was stale, and the floor was thick with dust, except for a faint path where the footprints continued, leading to a corner piled with crates. Miss Marple moved forward, her lamp illuminating the trail. The prince stopped abruptly at a large trunk, its lid slightly ajar. She knelt, her fingers brushing the dust, and found a smudge of mud, similar to that on Reed's boots. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice steady, "has anyone been here recently? These marks are fresh." Grayson's face remained unreadable. "Not to my knowledge, madam. Servants avoid this place. Perhaps a rat disturbed the dust." "Rats," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful, "do not wear boots." She opened the trunk, revealing only old linens, but the hinges were well oiled, suggesting recent use. She closed it, her mind racing. The attic was no mere storage room. It was a hiding place, or perhaps a stage for something more sinister. They descended. Miss Marple overheard raised voices from the drawing-room. She entered to find the guests in a heated exchange. Lord Harrington's face flushed as he argued with Mrs. Carver. "You've no right to pry into my affairs." "Butch, bum," snapped, while Mrs. Carver's voice trembled with indignation. "If Reed knew something, we all deserve to know." Monsieur Dupont stood apart. His eyes narrowed, while Miss Vaughan scribbled in her notebook, her expression gleeful. Mr. Drake, pale and silent, hovered near the door, his cufflinks untouched. Miss Marple's arrival silenced the room, and she seized the moment. "Lord Harrington," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "the attic has been visited recently, despite your claim it's unused. Footprints, fresh and deliberate, suggest someone was there. Perhaps Mr. Reed or someone who knows his fate. Can you account for this?" Harrington's jaw dropped, his bluster fading. "The attic? I've not been there in years. Grayson, what's this about?" Grayson, standing by the door, shook his head. "I've told Miss Marple, sir. The attic is locked. No one has access but me." "Yet someone did," Miss Marple said, her gaze sweeping the group. "And someone, I suspect, knows more than they've shared." Her eyes lingered on Drake, whose face paled further, and on Vaughan, whose pen froze mid-stroke. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their paranoia palpable. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking like a metronome. The footprints in the dust were a tangible clue, linking the attic to the mystery. Whether Reed was alive, hidden above, or a victim of a darker plot, she was one step closer to the truth. and the manor's secrets were beginning to stir. Chapter 9. The Clock That Stopped. The evening shadows lengthened across Briarwood Manor, casting an eerie pall over the library where Mr. Thomas Reed had vanished 2 nights prior. Miss Jane Marple stood before the grand fireplace, her lavender shawl neatly draped, her knitting tucked away as she surveyed the room with a discerning eye. The footprints in the attic, the hidden passage, the letter in Reed's room, and Mr. Drake's faltering alibi had woven a complex tapestry. But a new detail had caught her attention. The grandfather clock in the library's corner, its hands frozen at 10:17. The precise moment Miss Clara Vaughan's scream had shattered the silence. The guests had been summoned back to the library at Miss Marple's insistence, their faces a mix of exhaustion and dread. Lord Harrington stood by the door, his posture rigid, while Mrs. Evelyn Carver clutched her handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously. Mr. Julian Drake lingered near a bookshelf, his cufflinks untouched, his expression haunted. Monsieur Dupont leaned against the hearth, his silence heavy, and Miss Vaughan sat with her notebook, her pen poised but still. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, and Miss Marple's presence commanded their attention. "Time," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but resonant, "is a curious thing. It anchors us, yet it can also deceive. This clock—" She gestured to the towering oak timepiece, its pendulum still, stopped at 10:17, the moment Mr. Reed disappeared. "I find that most intriguing. Do any of you recall when it last chimed?" Lord Harrington frowned, his brow furrowing. "The clock. It's old, unreliable. It likely stopped hours before. I don't see the relevance, Miss Marple." "Oh, but it is relevant," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Mr. Grayson, you wound the clocks daily, do you not?" The butler, stationed by the door, nodded. "Yes, madam. I wound this one at 6 o'clock that evening. It was running smoothly." Then it stopped abruptly, Miss Marple said, stepping closer to the clock. Its face was ornate, its numerals Roman, but a faint scratch marred the glass, barely visible. She opened the clock's door, revealing the pendulum, which hung motionless, and a small brass weight, slightly askew, not wound down, but halted, perhaps deliberately. 10:17 marks the scream, but what else happened in that moment? Mrs. Carver's voice trembled. "You think someone stopped the clock? But why? We were all in chaos. Reed was gone." "Chaos," Miss Marple echoed, "is an excellent cloak for action. Let us revisit your accounts. Lord Harrington, you were by the door, fumbling for the key. Mr. Drake, you claim you were watching Miss Vaughan, though she did not see you. Miss Vaughan, you were writing until you screamed. Monsieur Dupont, you were by the shelves. And Mrs. Carver, you were near Lord Harrington. Yet none of you noticed the clock, or someone near it." Monsieur Dupont's lips twitched, his voice low. "I was focused on the hearth, mademoiselle. The clock was behind me." Miss Vaughan's pen scratched briefly, then stopped. "I didn't see the clock. I was looking at Reed, then he wasn't there. That's when I screamed." Drake cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "I told you, I was distracted. The clock didn't catch my eye." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, then shifted to Mrs. Carver. "And you, Mrs. Carver, you were closest to the clock's corner. Did you see anyone approach it?" Mrs. Carver's handkerchief twisted in her hands. "No, I was watching Lord Harrington, waiting for him to open the door. I didn't notice the clock at all." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. She reached into the clock's mechanism, her fingers brushing the weight. A faint click sounded, and she withdrew a small object, a torn scrap of paper wedged behind the pendulum. The guests leaned forward, their breaths held as she unfolded it. The paper bore a single word, scrawled in haste: "Truth." "Truth," Miss Marple murmured, holding the scrap to the light. "A message, perhaps, or a marker, placed here to stop the clock, to fix the moment of Mr. Reed's disappearance. Who among you might have left it?" Lord Harrington's face reddened. "This is nonsense. A scrap of paper proves nothing. The clock stopped by chance, and you're spinning fantasies." "Is it chance," Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but firm, "that the clock marks the exact moment of chaos? Or that this paper, with its singular word, was hidden where only a deliberate hand could place it?" She turned to the group, her eyes sweeping their faces. "Someone in this room acted in that moment. Someone who knew the clock's significance." Miss Vaughan's voice was sharp. "You're saying one of us stopped the clock to—" "What? Cover something up? Reed was already gone?" "Was he?" Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. The clock stopped. The scream sounded. The key was fumbled, all within seconds. The timeline is precise, yet your accounts are not. Mr. Drake, you admitted to lying about watching Miss Vaughan. Might you have been near the clock instead?" Drake's face paled, his hands clenching. "I wasn't! I was by the door, I swear it! I didn't touch the clock!" Monsieur Dupont's eyes narrowed. "And yet, monsieur, your story shifts. Perhaps you saw more than you claim." "Enough!" Mrs. Carver cried, her voice breaking. "You're turning us against each other. The clock, the paper, it's all a distraction. Reed is gone, and we're trapped here pointing fingers." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, a steady counterpoint to the rising tension. "Distraction, Mrs. Carver, or direction?" The clock stopped for a reason, and this word, truth, suggests someone wished to mark the moment, perhaps to guide us, or to mislead us. She slipped the scrap into her pocket, her mind racing. The clock's clue disrupted the guests, timelines suggesting a deliberate act in the library's chaos. Had Reed himself stopped the clock, leaving a message before vanishing? Or had another hand used it to obscure the truth? The footprints in the attic, the hidden passage, and now the clock formed a pattern, one she was determined to decipher. "We shall reconvene tomorrow," Miss Marple said, rising. "For now, I suggest you reflect on your actions at 10:17. Small details, my friends, often unravel the greatest mysteries." As the guests dispersed, their whispers sharp with suspicion, Miss Marple lingered by the clock, her fingers brushing the scratch on its glass. The word truth echoed in her mind, a beacon in the fog of deception. The locked room was no longer just a puzzle of space, but of time, and she was closing in on its heart. Chapter 10. The Shadow of Betrayal. The atmosphere in Briarwood Manor had grown brittle, like glass stretched to its breaking point. By the third day, the guests' nerves were frayed, their civility eroded by the relentless mystery of Mr. Thomas, Reed's disappearance. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her lavender shawl draped neatly, her knitting needles clicking with a steadiness that contrasted the chaos unfolding before her. The stopped clock, the attic footprints, The hidden passage and the letter in Reed's room had tightened the web of suspicion, and now the guests' alliances were beginning to fracture. The trouble began over tea, a ritual that had once been polite but now felt like a stage for confrontation. Lord Harrington, his silver hair dishevelled, poured himself a brandy instead of tea, his hands unsteady. Mrs. Evelyn Carver sat rigid, her handkerchief abandoned, her eyes burning with barely concealed anger. Mr. Julian Drake hovered near the window, his face pale, while Monsieur Dupont leaned against the mantel, his silence more menacing than words. Miss Clara Vaughan, her notebook open, scribbled with a fervour that seemed to feed on the tension. The spark came when Mrs. Carver turned to Lord Harrington, her voice sharp as a blade. "You've been evasive, Lionel. Reed knew something about you, something you didn't want aired. Why else would he come here, demanding a meeting?" Harrington's glass paused mid-air, his face flushing. "Evelyn, you're overwrought. Reed was a guest, nothing more. I've told you, his business was trivial, a minor investment long forgotten." "Forgotten?" Mrs. Carver's laugh was brittle, cutting through the room. "Don't lie to me. I heard you at dinner, hesitating when he mentioned your old partnership. He wasn't here for investments. He was here to expose you." The guests froze, their eyes darting between the two. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady as she absorbed the exchange. The letter in Reed's room, with its accusations of a soured deal, echoed in her mind. Mrs. Carver's outburst suggested she knew more than she had let on, perhaps tied to her late husband's business, which Reed had probed. Harrington slammed his glass on the table, brandy sloshing over the rim. "Expose me? That's absurd. You're grasping at shadows, Evelyn, and I won't stand for it. Reed was a nobody, a soldier with delusions of grandeur." "A nobody?" Monsieur Dupont's voice was low, his French accent cutting like a knife. "Yet you invited him, monsieur. A nobody does not warrant such attention. What did he have on you?" Harrington rounded on him, his voice rising. "Nothing. And I'll thank you to keep your insinuations to yourself, Dupont. You're a guest here, not an inquisitor." Miss Vaughan's pen scratched furiously, her eyes bright with excitement. "This is better than fiction," she muttered, earning a glare from Drake, who stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Enough, all of you," Drake said, his hands clenching. "You're tearing each other apart. And for what? Reed's gone, and we're no closer to answers. Maybe he left. On his own, staged it to rattle us." Mrs. Carver turned on him, her face contorted. "Staged it? Don't be a fool, Julian. You were terrified of him. You admitted it. That court-martial case, your client, Reed knew something, and you wanted him silenced." Drake's face drained of colour, his voice rising to a shout. "That's a lie. I had no reason to harm him. You're the one with secrets, Evelyn. Your husband's debts, his shady deals with Harrington. Maybe you wanted Reed gone to protect your precious reputation." The room erupted, voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusations. Harrington bellowed at Mrs. Carver, who snapped back with venom. Dupont's lips curled into a faint smile, as though he relished the chaos, while Vaughan scribbled, her notebook filling with the raw material of betrayal. Miss Marple remained silent, her eyes moving from face to face, cataloguing every word, every gesture. Finally, she rose, her small frame commanding the room's attention despite the uproar. "Please," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "This quarrelling serves no one. Mrs. Carver, you've implied a betrayal between Lord Harrington and Mr. Reed. Might you share what you know? The truth now will help us all." Mrs. Carver's shoulders slumped, her anger giving way to exhaustion. I don't know much," she admitted, her voice low. "My husband Charles worked with Harrington years ago. They invested in a shipping venture, but it failed, ruined us. Charles always suspected Harrington cheated him, kept profits for himself. When Reed asked me about it, I thought maybe he had proof." Harrington's face darkened, but he said nothing, his silence louder than any denial. Miss Marple nodded, her mind connecting the dots. The letter in Reed's room had mentioned documents, evidence of Harrington's misdeeds. Mrs. Carver's revelation confirmed Reed's mission, and a motive for someone to ensure he never spoke. "And you, Mr. Drake," Miss Marple said, turning to the barrister, "your fear of Reed suggests a personal connection. Your client's court-martial. Did it involve Lord Harrington or Mrs. Carver's husband?" Drake shook his head, his voice barely audible. "No, it was unrelated, just a coincidence. Reed's name came up in passing, that's all." But his eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple noted the lie in his trembling hands. Monsieur Dupont spoke, his tone cool. "Coincidences, monsieur, are rare in a house like this. You all have reasons to fear Reed, his questions, his past. Perhaps one of you acted to protect your secrets." "Or all of you," Miss Vaughan added, her voice gleeful, earning glares from the group. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking like a metronome. "Betrayal," she said softly, "casts a long shadow. Mr. Reed came here seeking justice, and someone, perhaps more than one, saw him as a threat. The locked room, the stopped clock, the attic footprints. They are not isolated clues, but parts of a larger truth." She paused, her eyes sweeping the group. "I suggest you consider your alliances carefully. Secrets shared in confidence can become weapons in the wrong hands." The guests fell silent, their faces etched with suspicion. As they dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on the fireplace where Reed had last stood. The argument had revealed more than accusations. It had exposed a web of greed, fear, and betrayal, with Reed at its centre. The shadow of that betrayal loomed over Briarwood Manor, and Miss Marple knew the next revelation would bring her closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 11. The Hidden Locksmith. The morning light in Briarwood Manor was dim, filtered through heavy clouds that pressed against the Gothic windows. Miss Jane Marple sat in the library, the epicentre of Mr. Thomas Reed's disappearance, her lavender shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, her attention fixed on the heavy oak door and its brass lock, which had sealed the room during the vanishing. The stopped clock, the attic footprints, the hidden passage, and the letter accusing Lord Harrington had all pointed to a calculated act. But the lock itself, its apparent inviolability, was the heart of the puzzle. Today, Miss Marple intended to unravel its secrets. The guests had been summoned to the library, their faces etched with weariness and suspicion after the previous day's heated argument. Lord Harrington stood by the hearth, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression a mix of defiance and fatigue. Mrs. Evelyn Carver sat rigidly, her handkerchief crumpled in her fist. Mr. Julian Drake hovered near a bookshelf, his cufflinks untouched, his eyes darting nervously. Monsieur Dupont leaned against a table, his cool demeanour unshaken, while Miss Clara Vaughan scribbled in her notebook, her curiosity undimmed. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and Miss Marple's presence held them in check. She rose, her small frame commanding the room, and approached the door. "This lock," she said, her voice clear and deliberate, "is no ordinary mechanism. It is complex, designed for security, yet Mr. Reed vanished from a room it sealed. I've been considering how such a lock might be breached, not by force, but by skill." Lord Harrington's brow furrowed. "Breached? Miss Marple, the key was in my pocket and the door was locked. You saw me open it. There's no sign of tampering." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming. "But locks, like people, can be persuaded by those who understand them. A locksmith, for instance, might manipulate such a mechanism, or craft a duplicate key." She paused, her gaze sweeping the guests. "I wonder if any of you possess such a skill." Mrs. Carver gasped, her voice sharp. "A locksmith? That's preposterous. None of us would have reason to tamper with the lock." Miss Marple's smile was faint but probing. "Reason, Mrs. Carver, is what we seek. Let us consider your backgrounds. Mr. Drake, as a barrister, you've dealt with cases involving theft and forgery. Might you have encountered lockpicking in your work?" Drake's face paled, his hands clenching. "Lockpicking? I'm a lawyer, not a criminal. I know nothing of locks beyond their legal implications." But his voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow. She turned to Monsieur Dupont, whose fingers had stilled their restless tapping. "And you, Monsieur Dupont? You described yourself as a businessman, but your reticence suggests a varied past. Locks are often a concern in certain trades." Dupont's lips curled into a faint smile, his accent smooth. "You are observant, mademoiselle, but I am no locksmith. My business is in imports, not burglary." Yet his eyes held hers, a challenge beneath his calm. Miss Vaughan snapped her notebook shut, her voice indignant. "This is absurd, Miss Marple. You're accusing us based on nothing. I'm a writer. I've never touched a lock in my life." Miss Marple nodded, unruffled. "Your protestations are noted, Miss Vaughan, but skills can be hidden like secrets." She knelt by the door, her fingers brushing the lock's brass plate. A faint scratch, barely visible, marred its surface, not the work of a key, but of a finer tool, perhaps a pick. She straightened, her mind racing. This mark suggests the lock was manipulated, subtly but deliberately, not to open it perhaps, but to ensure it appeared secure. Lord Harrington's voice was gruff. "Appeared secure? The door was locked, Miss Marple. I turned the key myself." "So you did," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But a skilled hand could lock or unlock it without your key, or make it seem so." She turned to the butler, Mr. Grayson, who stood by the door, his face impassive. "Mr. Grayson, you've served Briarwood for years. Have you ever known this lock to be serviced or a duplicate key made?" Grayson's eyes flickered, but his voice was steady. "No, madam. The lock is original, and the key is unique, as I've said." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, then shifted to the guests. "Unique, yet vulnerable to expertise. I've made inquiries through a friend in the village, a locksmith who knows Briarwood's history. He mentioned a guest years ago who repaired a similar lock in this very room. A man with a military background, skilled in mechanics. The guests exchanged glances, their unease palpable. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but relentless. Mr. Reed was a soldier, but his skills were in combat, not craftsmanship. However, Monsieur Dupont, your travels in Europe, did they include time in regions known for fine metalwork? Perhaps lock-making? Dupont's smile faded, his posture stiffening. You overreach, mademoiselle. I am no craftsman. My travels were for trade, not trades. Yet you carry a pocket-knife, Miss Marple said, her eyes on the slight bulge in his coat. A tool, with many uses, including delicate work. Might I see it? Dupont hesitated, then produced a slim knife, its blade etched with intricate designs. Miss Marple examined it, noting a faint scratch on the tip, consistent with lockpicking. Most versatile, she said, returning it. A tool that could, in skilled hands, persuade a lock. Dupont's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The other guests shifted, their suspicion now fixed on him. Mrs. Carver's voice was a whisper. You think he unlocked the door? But how? Reed was gone in seconds. Seconds, Miss Marple said, are enough for a practised hand, especially in chaos. She turned to the group, her voice firm. The lock was no barrier to someone with skill. Whether Monsieur Dupont or another, one of you knows more about this door than you've admitted. Miss Vaughan's pen scratched, her voice eager. This is incredible. A hidden locksmith among us. It's like a novel. Lord Harrington's face darkened. It's not a novel, Miss Vaughan. It's my home, and I won't have it slandered. Miss Marple, you've no proof, only scratches and guesses. Proof, Miss Marple said, her needles resuming their click, is built from such guesses. The lock, the clock, the footprints, they are pieces of a truth we are close to uncovering. As the guests dispersed, their whispers sharp with distrust, Miss Marple lingered by the door, her fingers brushing the scratch on the lock. The hidden locksmith was no longer a shadow, but a presence, and the library's secrets were yielding to her relentless pursuit. Chapter 12. The Truth Behind the Door. The library of Briarwood Manor was steeped in an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. Miss Jane Marple stood at the centre of the room, her lavender shawl draped neatly, her eyes bright with the clarity of revelation. The guests, Lord Harrington, Mrs. Evelyn Carver, Mr. Julian Drake, Monsieur Dupont, and Miss Clara Vaughan, sat in a tense circle, their faces a mosaic of fear, defiance, and anticipation. The clues had mounted: the hidden passage, the stopped clock, the attic footprints, the letter in Reed's room, the scratched lock. Now Miss Marple was ready to weave them into the truth behind Mr. Thomas Reed's disappearance. She began, her voice soft but commanding. A locked room is a puzzle, but not an impossibility. Mr. Reed vanished from this library at 10:17, as the clock marked, leaving no trace. Yet the truth lies not in magic, but in human intent. Let us reconstruct that night. She turned to the oak door, its brass lock gleaming. Lord Harrington, you locked this door, ensuring privacy for your announcement. The windows were barred, the room sealed, yet Reed was gone in moments, and the key, you claimed, never left your pocket. Harrington nodded, his jaw tight. Exactly. The door was locked. I opened it myself after the scream. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the hearth. Miss Vaughan, you screamed, claiming Reed had vanished. Mr. Drake, you were by the door, distracted. Mrs. Carver, you were near Lord Harrington. And Monsieur Dupont, you stood by the shelves. A chaotic moment, perfect for deception. Mrs. Carver's handkerchief twisted in her hands. Deception? You think one of us made him disappear? Not one, Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming, but two, working together. A gasp rippled through the room, and she continued, her voice steady. The key to this mystery is the lock, and the hidden passage I found behind the tapestry. But first, let us consider motive. She produced the letter from Reed's room. Its words, accusing Harrington of betrayal. Mr. Reed came to confront Lord Harrington about a failed venture that ruined him. He had evidence, documents that could disgrace you, Lord Harrington. You invited him here not for reconciliation, but to silence him. Harrington's face reddened. That's outrageous. I invited him to discuss business, nothing more. Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing him. Yet you had help, Monsieur Dupont. Your skills as a locksmith, evident in the scratches on the lock, and your versatile knife, allowed you to manipulate the door's mechanism. You didn't unlock it, but you ensured it could be opened later, without the key. Dupont's smile was cold. A bold claim, mademoiselle, but you have no proof. I have enough, Miss Marple said, her tone firm. The passage behind the tapestry leads to a grate beneath the library's floor, accessible from the attic. The footprints I found there, and the mud matching Reed's boots, tell the story. Reed was lured into the passage, not by force, but by trust. She turned to Mrs. Carver, whose face had paled. Mrs. Carver, your husband was part of that failed venture. Reed's questions about his dealings stirred your fear that your own secrets, debts hidden to preserve your status, would surface. You agreed to help Lord Harrington, didn't you? Mrs. Carver's voice was a whisper. No. I didn't. I couldn't. But you did, Miss Marple said gently. You signalled Reed during Lord Harrington's speech. A glance, a whisper, urging him to meet you discreetly. He trusted you, perhaps because of your shared loss. You led him to the tapestry, where the passage awaited. Miss Vaughan's pen stopped, her eyes wide. The passage? But how did he get there without us seeing? The chaos, Miss Marple said. Miss Vaughan, your scream was no accident. You saw Reed move toward the tapestry, guided by Mrs. Carver, and you screamed to distract us, to cover his exit. Your notebook, filled with details, was a pretense. You were part of the plan, ensuring the room's attention was elsewhere. Vaughan's face flushed. That's absurd. I screamed because he was gone. Miss Marple shook her head. You screamed to mark the moment. The clock, stopped at 10:17 with the word truth, was your touch, Miss Vaughan. A writer's flourish meant to mislead, but it fixed the timeline, proving Reed was already in the passage when the scream sounded. Drake's voice trembled. But why? Why go to such lengths? Motive, Miss Marple said. Lord Harrington faced ruin if Reed's evidence surfaced. Mrs. Carver feared exposure of her debts. Miss Vaughan, you sought a story, a real-life mystery to fuel your next novel, with Harrington's promise of patronage. Monsieur Dupont, your payment was financial, a deal to secure your silence. She paced to the hearth, her voice rising. Here's how it happened. Before the gathering, Dupont prepared the lock, ensuring it could be opened from the passage. Mrs. Carver lured Reed behind the tapestry, where the hidden panel led to the grate. Reed entered, expecting a private meeting, but found himself trapped. Dupont, waiting in the passage, sealed the grate, and Reed was spirited to the attic where the footprints ended. Harrington's voice was hoarse. "To the attic? Then where is he now?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, a hint of sorrow in her voice. "I fear Mr. Reed is no longer in the manor. The attic trunk, with its oiled hinges, was used to hide him briefly. Monsieur Dupont, with his strength and skill, moved him elsewhere, perhaps to the grounds, where the mist concealed your actions. The mud on Reed's boots suggests he was taken outside, alive or otherwise." Dupont's smile vanished, his hands clenching. "You weave a tale, mademoiselle, but you cannot prove it." "I can," Miss Marple said, producing a small object. From her pocket, a brass fitting matching the grate's lock, found in the attic. "This was left behind, Monsieur Dupont, in your haste. And Mr. Grayson, who overheard your late-night movements, has agreed to testify." The butler, standing by the door, nodded solemnly. The guests' faces crumbled. Harrington's defiance, Carver's fear, Vaughan's indignation, Dupont's calm, all gave way to guilt. Drake, uninvolved but complicit in his silence, hung his head. Miss Marple folded her hands, her voice quiet but resolute. The locked room was no miracle, but a conspiracy of greed and fear. Mr. Reed sought truth, and you buried it behind the door. As the guests sat in stunned silence, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the lock, its scratches a testament to the crime. The truth was out, but the cost of Reed's life, of trust, hung heavy in the air. Chapter 13. The Guest Who Never Left. The mist had lifted from Briarwood Manor, but a chill remained, as though the house itself mourned the truths uncovered within its walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, her packing nearly complete, her lavender shawl folded neatly beside her small suitcase. The fire in the grate burned low, casting a soft glow on the intricate wallpaper, and outside the gardens lay quiet under a grey dawn. The mystery of Mr. Thomas Reed's disappearance had been solved, yet its echoes lingered, a reminder of the fragility of trust and the weight of hidden sins. The previous evening's revelations in the library had shattered the guests' facades. Lord Harrington, his empire of wealth built on betrayal, had confessed to orchestrating Reed's removal, though he claimed no knowledge of his ultimate fate. Mrs. Evelyn Carver, driven by fear of her own ruin, had crumbled into tears, admitting her role in luring Reed to the hidden passage. Miss Clara Vaughan, her ambition for a sensational story exposed, had burned her notebook in a fit of shame, while Monsieur Dupont, the locksmith whose skills sealed the plot, had offered no defence, his silence an admission of guilt. Mr. Julian, Drake, though not a conspirator, had been complicit in his cowardice, his lies shielding his own fears. The authorities had been summoned. By morning, the conspirators were in custody, awaiting charges of conspiracy and potentially murder, for Reed's body had not been found. The attic trunk, the muddy boots, and the brass fitting from the grate suggested he had been taken from the manor. But the grounds, searched thoroughly, yielded no trace. Miss Marple suspected Dupont's efficiency, Perhaps a hidden well or a distant ravine held Reed's final secret. But she left such matters to the police, her role as truth-seeker complete. She rose, her movements deliberate, and crossed to the window, her eyes tracing the manor's spires against the sky. Briarwood was a house of secrets, its passages and locks a mirror for the human heart. People, she mused aloud, are so often their own undoing. Greed, fear, ambition. They build walls stronger than any lock, and yet they crumble under scrutiny. Her thoughts turned to Reed, the soldier who had come seeking justice for a betrayal long buried. His letter, with its quiet resolve, had been his voice, and though he was gone, Miss Marple felt he had achieved a kind of victory. The truth, marked by the clock's stopped hands and the word truth, had prevailed, exposing those who sought to bury it. Yet a question lingered. Had Reed truly left Briarwood, or did his presence linger, a ghost in the manor's shadows? As she prepared to depart, a soft knock came at the door. Mr. Grayson, the butler, stood there, his face as impassive as ever, though his eyes held a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or relief. "Your car is ready, Miss Marple," he said, "and I wish to thank you. The manor has been heavy with secrets for too long." Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle. "Secrets, Mr. Grayson, have a way of finding the light. You did well to speak of Monsieur Dupont's movements. Truth is a burden, but it frees us." Grayson hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There's something else, madam. Last night, after the arrests, I heard a sound like footsteps in the library. I checked, but no one was there. The lock was secure, the room empty." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained serene. "Footsteps," she said softly. "How curious. Old houses, Mr. Grayson, often carry echoes of those who pass through. Perhaps Mr. Reed's story is not quite finished." Grayson nodded, a shadow crossing his face, and withdrew. Miss Marple gathered her things, her mind turning over his words. The library, with its scratched lock and hidden passage, had been the stage for Reed's vanishing, but footsteps in an empty room suggested something more. A presence, perhaps, or a final message. She dismissed the thought as fanciful. Yet a part of her, honed by years of unravelling human mysteries, wondered if Reed had left a mark beyond the clues she had found. As the car carried her away from Briarwood, the manor receding into the mist, Miss Marple opened her knitting bag and retrieved a small object she had kept from the attic. The tarnished pocket watch inscribed to Reed by Lord Harrington, a relic of their lost friendship. She turned it over in her hands, its cracked face a testament to broken bonds. "Poor Mr. Reed," she murmured, "you came for truth, and truth you found, though it cost you dearly." The car rounded a bend, and Briarwood vanished from view, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the library, on the footsteps Grayson had heard. The guest who never left, she thought, might yet have one more tale to tell. A whisper in the walls, a shadow behind the door. And with that, she closed, her eyes the rhythm of the road lulling her into a quiet reflection on the enduring mysteries of the human soul.